I'm Kelsey Litchfield, and this is the Field Advisor Podcast, where I talk with local experts to unpack the latest agronomy information and research, giving you the knowledge to make informed decisions out in the field. Welcome back, everyone, to the Field Advisor Podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Litchfield. And again, we're talking about weather. Weather is always a topic, of course, out in the fields, and it's constantly changing, that's for sure. Mother Nature always is hitting us with what's next type of thing. So I'm happy to have Matt Reardon with Nutrien Ag Solutions back on the podcast. Matt, I want to start with Southern Illinois because they just keep getting hit with rain event after rain event. I'm curious, why is this happening? Like, why are they getting the onslaught of rain this year?
Yeah, we've seen really kind of starting in Southern Illinois and then pushing all the way through the Mid-South. So even in, I think, early April, right, we had the severe flooding in portions of the Ohio River Valley. Saw pictures of the, Cincinnati Reds ballpark with water, up to the side of the levees there. That extended through Southern Illinois into parts of Arkansas. And then almost you could draw a line from the middle Mississippi River all the way into Oklahoma, parts of North Texas, which are receiving rainfall right now from remnant overnight storms. And the reason for that is we've kind of have right now this broad spinning low pressure system that's been parked at times over the Midwest. And that has kept this flow constantly moving out of the Northwest toward the Mid-South. And then we've had plenty of return flow, that is southeast flow, coming out from the Atlantic. And it's just been on its collision course, really, right over maybe the Tennessee River Valley, extending up into the Ohio River Valley. That makes its way to Illinois, the southern portions of the state, and they've just been dumped on. And then along with that, unfortunately, and this can be the case this time of year, we've seen severe weather. I think about the St. Louis metro area, how many observed tornadoes we've seen there. It's almost like every weekend I'm getting a notification that there's an observed tornado moving through some suburb, if not the downtown part of St. Louis, like we saw a few weeks ago, unfortunately. So hoping for a break here for them soon. They're definitely getting one here early this week with the sun coming out. We talked about just finally getting some heat on the early crop out there as well.
Yeah. So you think hopefully in the near term that they'll get out of this pattern that's been getting them rain constantly, or do you have an idea of what's to come in the next month or so in terms of Southern Illinois?
Yeah, I would expect that the active pattern will continue. The good news I have there is just what we're seeing outside here today, and that is warm temperatures increasing throughout the week here across the whole state of Illinois, getting up. Finally, our highs in the 80s. It feels funny to be pining for just, mid to high 80s in June. We tend to do that pretty easily here, but not recently. So getting some warmer temperatures on the crop. I think we've seen crop stands emerge into these relatively cool temperatures. They're not cold by, winter or spring standards, but 70s, low 80s. Suddenly we have GDD deficits since that plant has emerged. I think we're seeing that reflected in the crop stands out there. Might even crack 90 this week in Illinois. That'll help get some GDDs back. But then we're looking at another more active stretch with precipitation chances picking up this weekend. I think that extends into next week with some relatively, quote unquote, cool temperatures for June.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was driving down to the St. Louis area end of last week, and it's just so interesting to see the difference in fields. In my area, there's a couple of soybean fields that look phenomenal. There's other soybeans that are just trying to grow, and it seems like they're in neutral, as one of our soy envoys put it last week. So the temperatures definitely a lot are looking to get into the 80s and 90s because we are in early June. Like, I guess, what is average temperature, or do we feel behind or below average this time of year? Like, it just feels like we're just really vibing for these higher temperatures, which you said would come at the end of this week.
Yeah. So, mid 80s are expected in June. We typically get up into the high 80s right at the end of the month. Into July, we're known for easily cracking 9-degree temperatures. But even the nights have been cooler. This morning I woke up and it was chilly outside. Walked outside in short sleeve and had a second thought about it, which again, June, that's not typical. So the colder temperatures now, right, don't feel like they do in March or April, but the crop is feeling that in those GDD deficits. So you're right. Temperatures warming up the end of this week, 80s, maybe even getting into the 90s Thursday, but that's also going to bring with it, right, that southerly wind. We know that's carrying moisture. And so it's kind of not a coincidence that at the end of this week, going into this weekend, especially, those rain chances pick up for Southern Illinois all the way through Northern Illinois. And I bring that up. If you've driven the whole length of the state here at the end of May or going into June, maybe Rockford all the way down to Cairo, you just watch beige fields turn to green, and
Mhm.
beige trees, which are struggling with some drought. They're in some drought classifications in northern Illinois, right down to just everything is dark green in the southern part of the state. So different parts of the state feeling different things. We're trying to get rain up into the northern part of the state. I think anywhere I-72 and north, we need some more frequent rain events as long as we can get some heat in there. But you go south, right, and we're just looking for an extended window for once.
Right. Speaking of drought, is that still a concern for you this summer? Is there less chance? I did see over the weekend, I believe it was your colleague Eric Snodgrass was talking about all this moisture down in southern Illinois. They're now factoring that in with the drought. So, talk a little bit about what the outlook now is with all these recent rains we've been having.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioned Eric. We have been talking nonstop this weekend about this kind of changing drought forecast, if you will. And it's a common time of year. Kelsey, we were just talking this morning about how we're so kind of scatterbrained trying to get a crop in the ground. Everyone's talking about, can I just get out in the fields and work? You're looking out windows. And then now that everyone's planted, we get into early June and we're just sitting here kind of with our hands on our knees in a holding pattern, like what's next? And so we're starting to talk about, look into the forecast for what is next. I think the drought conversation has shifted a bit over the last few weeks into less drought risk, just to put it in a blunt way. Kind of going into the year because of a background La Nina, because of some fall drought that we came out of last year. Those things both tend to correlate with Midwest drought the following growing season. Now, those correlations aren't particularly strong. There's no perfect home runs in this science. It's very much inexact. But we knew going into this year that drought risk was elevated across portions of the Midwest. Illinois would be included in that. We've seen so much rain to our south. We just talked about southern Illinois. And you can think of that almost like a savings bank, because our rain events, the moisture is typically sourced from the Gulf of Mexico or to our south. That's a perfect example of this week. We start to turn the winds around out of the south versus out of the west, which we'll feel early this week. And as that wind component comes out of the south, it's going to be pulling that moisture up, and you see rain chances skyrocket almost immediately. And so now you think, what's to our south? Moist trees, overflowed rivers, right? Plenty of moisture in the ground. That's going to be transpired, evaporated up into the atmosphere, recycling that as it's making its way north toward Illinois. And we actually went back and looked at every significant drought year. Let's call it, yield robbing drought years, down to 10 to 20% off trend for Illinois, Iowa, Indiana. And none of those years had as much moisture now in early June. That's to our south. So if we were going to have a big drought year this year, it would be the first one with this much moisture in that savings bank to the south. Now, that's not me saying it's impossible, right? The sample size isn't big enough,
Right.
but it certainly reduces the risk of that heading into July.
But our friends in Northern Illinois, they're still in that D1 drought. I mean, our crop reports, they've been coming in saying they've got some rain, but it's not enough. So what should they be expecting to hopefully get out of that drought concern right now?
My big concern I've been calling it the I-80 drought. Just it stretches kind of curiously right along the interstate. You can almost draw a line from southern Michigan, northern Indiana, all the way through the Chicago metro area, over into Rockford, west into eastern Iowa. Now, earlier, maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, I was really concerned about central and eastern Nebraska and into western Iowa, again, right along I-80. Now, my concern for that has lessened just because they've had a decent amount of rain here over the last week or two. What we didn't see is that same kind of glut of moisture move into northern Illinois specifically. The next 7 to 10 day forecast, we have rain chances coming through, but they've been a little bit uncertain, anywhere from like a half inch to maybe an inch over the next week or two for northern Illinois into southern Wisconsin, included in that southern Michigan. Now, if they pick up an inch and a half of rain, we get some thunderstorms moving through those in the next 7 to 10 days. It kind of delays that concern again for another 10 to 15 days. And we've seen that trend consistently this spring, because if you look, just like you said, they've had rain.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at the accumulated precip chart over the last 30 to 90 days, it doesn't look like one of these big plateau droughts that we typically concern ourselves with. I mean, there's this nice stair step every week or two, but it's always just a little bit less than everywhere else. And now that's showing up in soil moisture deficits. It's showing up in that D1 drought classification. And so we need a hit on some of these rainfall events. If we miss this week and we end up on the low dry side of that forecast scenario right now, my concern for July, when we start shifting from this is something to watch to water stress, that crop is going to become sensitive to that in July, especially in those reproductive growth periods. And undoubtedly, if we lack those rainfall events there, we're going to start to see a hit to yields.
Yeah. So we're June 9th, we're recording this. What is your outlook going into the rest of June? And then carrying on what you just said, depending on that, then what should farmers be aware of going into July? Keeping a close eye on the drought monitor, but then also it seems like there's some storm chances as well. And I know a few of those derechos have come through June
Right.
in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning derechos. We may have had one just yesterday through parts of North Texas. These are
Hmm.
straight line wind events. They can contain embedded smaller tornadoes, but our primary concern with those sorts of thunderstorms are just long stretches of thunderstorm, severe threshold winds, right? Bring around power lines, outages, and then, of course, can lodge crop stands later in the year when they're a little bit taller. If they have hail embedded in there, then you have even bigger issues. And the reason I bring that up is because we're seeing this critical transition, I would say, at the end of this week. I mentioned that heat picking up of what we call ridge riding thunderstorms. You'll hear us meteorologists talk about these every summer, like clockwork around the end of June as we approach the solstice, because the central part of our country tends to warm up quickly relative to the cooler oceans in the eastern Pacific and the western Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. When it does that, and that prime sun right over our heads, we get these ridges that typically develop, and I'll call it the south central portion of the country, Wichita Falls. We look at maybe portions of Texas, Oklahoma. They get underneath that. We start seeing 100-degree Fahrenheit forecasts for those areas. But we're on typically the periphery of that ridge where those ridge riding thunderstorms like to
Hmm.
live. Northern Illinois, especially, it's like, the alley for these derecho-like ridge riding thunderstorm events. And we're seeing that transition start to occur this weekend. And that's why next week those precipitation chances start increasing. Now, the caveat with that is these ridge riding thunderstorms kind of have a mind of their own. They're not moving along a low pressure system like a typical spring system would, where my certainty for those precipitation values and the chances themselves would be higher. These can putter out in the evening, and then they don't make their way across Iowa into northern Illinois, or they can show up poorly resolved by some of our forecast models. And this is one of the reasons that these big derecho events often relatively poorly forecasted from the National Weather Service. And that's simply because they're hard to model. There's no kind of strong low pressure system attached to those rainfall chances.
Mm-hmm.
But when they do come through, right, you can get an inch or two of rainfall in just an afternoon.
Yeah. Along with everything else, the wind, the hail,
Yep.
everything. So be on the lookout for that for sure. Anything else that you want to share with farmers that should be on their radar in terms of weather?
Yeah, I think this June has been a little bit interesting because we're talking about the tropics so early. We had Tropical Storm Alvin that formed in the far eastern Pacific. That was kind of just off the coast of Mexico. It ended up actually making its way as a remnant system up into Arizona and brought very anomalous rainfall in June. This is typically bone dry period for the Arizona desert before their monsoon kicks in later this summer. And a lot of people are going to dismiss that as well. That's far away. It's off in the eastern Pacific. Arizona's not near Illinois. Those tropical storms matter. They can impact
Mm-hmm.
the jet stream. Just talked about those ridge riding thunderstorms. Those subtropical ridges that typically develop over Texas or Oklahoma can be very easily disrupted by one of these storm systems. We actually saw that with Alvin briefly. We're expecting additional systems in the eastern Pacific potentially developing this week. We'll see how many, maybe low chance of development in the far western Atlantic as the result of what we call a Central American gyre. This is a spinning air that sits around the kind of isthmus or the Central American connection between the two continents, and it can spin up in June. We found these weak
Mm-hmm.
tropical systems, either storms or a weak hurricane. And if those continue over the next 10 to 15 days, they're going to add a lot of uncertainty into the forecast. They could potentially weaken that ridge, and then that could throw some uncertainty into that ridge riding thunderstorm forecast that I just had. So when you see the National Hurricane Center, the news talking about these hurricanes that may be far away from the U.S. landfall, they do have importance for where our forecast is going. In the case of Alvin, they can even bring up some tropical moisture and launch that across the continental divide and improve some of our rainfall events going into end of June. So still some uncertainty with those. The National Hurricane Center is following that, but it's
Yeah.
just kind of interesting work.
Hurricane season is here, or it starts in July,
It starts in
correct?
June for
June.
the
Okay.
Atlantic, at the end of May for the Eastern Pacific. It starts in June, but we typically don't see a lot of activity until we really get into August and then September thereafter. So June and July, we see a few systems, maybe once or twice in a year, but it just so happens it's starting early.
And that could be nice because I know in years past, hurricanes have spun up into the country July, August, especially August for some of these soybean fields. That's good, timely rains for them as well. So, I mean, it's not, it would be bad in certain parts of the US to have a hurricane, but I know in years past, we've talked about hurricanes coming into the state with all the rainfall remnants. and it was good. So, I mean, if you're trying to find the glass half full with some of those situations, but although knowing, I've talked with some people from Florida and they're like, yeah, they said they'd rather have hurricanes than tornadoes. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah.
I'm immediately reminded of Hurricane Beryl from last year, right, where we had dryness starting to percolate and get into the eastern Corn Belt. We were sitting there, I think in early July, we were like, we could really just use a good 2 inches of rain across Indiana, southern Michigan, and Beryl just came right up, almost like prayers answered. Of course, we can't say that for the areas where these hurricanes make landfalls, but
right.
It's an easy kind of cheat to get moisture in here in July and August.
Yeah, definitely. Matt, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Texas earlier. Any other notable weather events happening in the U.S., around the globe? I know some people are following Brazil still. Anything that you've noted that might be worthy to highlight in this conversation?
Yeah, you think about our growing season in 2025. So the Northern Hemisphere, we're kind of less focused on South America as we go through our summer and their winter. But the drought concern that we started the year with, I would say here in North America, we saw similar correlations with those remnant La Nina being one checkbox and some other factors with regards to sea surface temperatures, some other things in the atmosphere. We're also highlighting an area of increased drought risk in Eastern Europe. It's a huge grain growing region. Includes some corn, sunflowers, a few soybeans, but also significant cereal and wheat belt, as well as heading all the way into Russia. We're seeing that forecast continue to highlight drought concern. Now, they have had rain here recently. I would say they're maybe in a similar boat to us, as they've had a little bit more rain than expected in spring, maybe even let's call it early summer here, but those forecasts don't want to shake that drought risk yet. And so keep an eye on Eastern Europe. They could be dealing with a similar kind of drought episode this summer if some of those forecasts hold true. And if I was over there in some of those states, I'd be concerned heading into their growing season. And there's significant exports over there in some cases.
Matt, anything else?
No, thanks for having me on, Kelsey.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt, for providing this weather update. As we're heading into these summer months, I hope to keep these updates, short and concise as possible of what farmers need to know, but also if something comes up like a derecho, heaven forbid, or, something, we'll pull Matt into the conversation and see. But as always, you can follow crop conditions, field observations on our crop report. Matt also writes a blog once a month for Field Advisor, so you can follow him on there. I know he's pretty active on Twitter. I just saw, or X, I should say. I saw his tweet. I don't know if they still call them tweets, but last night about Texas. So interesting follow for weather that's happening not only here in Illinois, but across the country. And then, like you were just talking about, across the world. So thanks, Matt. We appreciate you coming on today.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Enjoy your week.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor podcast on your favorite podcast platform.